After 3 months of military operations in Libya, the questions are mounting about NATO's ability to bring about a resolution to the conflict. What is NATO's missions achieving? Are there any other options, and what's the likelihood that it might succeed? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Taimur Nabili. Now, the White House has been forced to defend President Obama's policy on Libya after a group of congressmen filed a lawsuit against the president. The bipartisan group says the president's actions violate the U.S. Constitution and a little-known statute called the War Powers Act. Now, the lawsuit comes just a day after South Africa's President Jacob Zuma once again criticised NATO's military action in Libya. Zuma said the military alliance is misusing its mandate from the United Nations. And he went on to say, "We strongly believe that the resolution is being abused for regime change, political assassinations and foreign military occupation. These actions undermine the efforts of the African Union in finding solutions to the problems facing its member states." And the criticism of NATO is not simply confined to its role in Libya. Last week, the outgoing U.S. Defense Secretary Robert Gates criticized the organization as a whole and specifically its European members. Here's part of what he had to say.
Despite more than 2 million troops in uniform, not counting the U.S. military, NATO has struggled, at times desperately, to sustain a deployment of 25,000 to 40,000 troops, not just in boots on the ground, but in crucial support assets such as helicopters, transport aircraft, maintenance, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and much more. The mightiest military alliance in history is only 11 weeks into an operation against a poorly armed regime in a sparsely populated country, yet many allies are beginning to run short of munitions, requiring the U.S. once more to make up the difference.
Well, to discuss some of those criticisms and the current situation on the ground in Libya, I'm joined by three guests. In Washington, D.C., Justin Logan is Associate Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. In London, Guma el-Gamaty is the UK representative for the Transitional National Council in Libya. And in Paris, Philip Stonor is a former naval officer, a Royal Navy warfare officer to be precise, a helicopter pilot during the Falklands War, and most recently Deputy Defence Attaché to the UK mission in France. Gentlemen, thank you all very much indeed for joining us on the programme today. Guma, let me begin with you, if I might. The Transitional Council has often been quite scathing about NATO's role, saying that in fact it's not doing enough. Now you have the US, members of the US Congress, trying to get the US to withdraw its participation in what's going on. How does that make you feel?
Well, I'm not going to be drawn on the internal dynamics between the Congress and the White House in America. That's well known. That's for American politics. All I know is that the campaign in Libya is going reasonably well. Today, many civilians were protected. If it wasn't for the of the United Nations resolution and the international alliance implementing that resolution, many more, possibly tens of thousands of civilians would have been killed. So we believe that it is working. It's just a matter of time. 4 months down the road, Gaddafi is much weaker today, and he's getting isolated, and he's been pushed now to almost come to a standstill in Tripoli.
Well, let me interrupt you for a second there, because that is something of a change of tone, isn't it? Because, as I say, previously you've been critical of NATO for not doing enough.
Yes, but we still would like them to do a lot more. We still would like them to target all those Gaddafi forces who are from time to time advance on cities and towns, columns and columns of multi-rocket launchers and others. We would like them to be much more responsive and much more intense and much more quick in responding to those threats. But at the same time, as I said, it is going reasonably well, and the alternative would have been tens of thousands of civilians that might have been killed. Already we have lost over 13,000, but the alternative would have been much better. Obviously, I'm not also going to be drawn on the internal dynamics of the NATO members, some 29 countries who always squabble between each other about resources and about who's contributing what. That is for them to sort out. As far as we are concerned, we, the Libyans, we believe that the Security Council resolution is being implemented and it should be implemented to the end, and civilians should be protected.
All right, well, let me stop you there
and give. Is taken away.
Let's get that U.S. Perspective then. Justin Logan, the situation facing President Obama is, as Guma el-Gamaty has pointed out, actually probably more an issue of domestic politics and infighting than anything that will really affect the actions in Libya. But nonetheless, the perspective from where you sit is the Libya operation from NATO and the U.S.'s involvement in it going quite as well as Guma seems to want to think?
Well, it seems from my vantage point in Washington clear that from a military operational standpoint, what's going on is that the United States and its NATO allies are taking sides in a civil war in Libya. And it would be better to speak clearly about that, but of course that's not the mandate that was granted by the Security Council resolution. We've had President Obama state that the policy objective is the removal of Colonel Gaddafi from power. We're currently using military force, air power, to attempt to diminish his command and control, his communications, and a number of other military assets. But the president is at great pains to insist that that military campaign has nothing to do with the policy objective of removing Muammar Gaddafi from power. So there's a certain sort of double talk and silliness that's involved here. And you know, the president is standing in a great tradition of American presidents doing violence to the U.S. Constitution and the War Powers Act by usurping war powers for himself, whereas they're actually vested in the Congress.
All right, Philip Stonor, the situation from where you sit, I imagine, is probably quite similar, isn't it? We've got Justin talking about silliness and that kind of thing going on, but it's been characterized by a degree of silliness right from the beginning, hasn't it?
Well, I think what you have to realize when you look at the Gates speech, you have a situation where he is on the moment, he's leaving, he's about to depart, and it has always been traditional for people to actually give a keynote speech on the departure. Many of the things that he brought up, we've known about for years. This is something that's been going on between NATO nations for some years, the lack of resources that has been put forward. And it's quite clear that his parting shot, as he was about to leave, I think, has been carefully well orchestrated with the NATO Secretary General and with key allies to make sure that pressure is...
I want to talk about NATO as an organisation and what Gates had to say about it in a short while, but first just focusing on what is going on in Libya. Now, Guma's perspective here has been, as I said, a much more diplomatic and much more positive-looking one than we've heard out of Libyan opposition in past months, and the impression seems to be that they are happy to see the possibility that we have now transitioned into what seems to be an attempt to kill Gaddafi rather than simply persuade him that he should step down. Do you think that the NATO initiative is actually heading that way, and is it going to be successful?
I think there's an inevitability to the fact that in the issue of what they call in coded language protecting civilians, every time you hear a politician talk, it's all to do with protecting civilians. That is basically means regime change, in any other words. And they would only be too delighted if they were able to take out Gaddafi and some members of his close family. But the reality is they have to be able to put it forward with a facade, and the facade is what we're doing at the moment.
And Justin, you were nodding at that, and there was a great deal of play made when the 1973 resolution was first put forward, that this was a protective resolution, that it was in fact fairly tightly scripted, that the aim here was not regime change, and everyone stood up to deny it. And now everyone is quietly kind of tacitly admitting that in fact that was what the initial intention was. Why don't they just come out and say it now then and get it over with? Because surely it can't be that difficult to get rid of him if now we accept that that's the plan.
Well, then to do so would be admitting facially that you're in violation of the UN resolution itself. So I think that everyone who's been watching the campaign, it's impossible to suspend disbelief to the extent that one can believe that the military mission that's being pursued is protecting civilians. It's clear to all observers, it sounds like, that the actual aim is regime change, but that of course brings you back to the fact that there was no way that there was going to be a Security Council resolution authorizing the use of military force for the purpose of removing Muammar Gaddafi from power. So essentially they had to mislead the United Nations in general about what the purpose of the mission was, but then if you watch actually the operations that are going on, it's abundantly clear to everybody what the actual mission is.
Guma, do you think that they should just simply go all out to attack Tripoli and find Gaddafi with some kind of target-seeking missile and just get the job over with?
Well, look, you know, we have confirmed reports that Gaddafi occasionally sleeps in hotels full of foreign journalists. He sleeps in hospitals. He sleeps even on the top of national museums. Now, in those places, are NATO going to bomb him? Of course not. But if Gaddafi is sitting in the main command and control center in Tripoli, ordering his forces to shell the cities of Misratas, Leighton, Zintan, you know, Gil'a, Yifrin, and order gang rape, then he puts himself there as a target. People might not know he's sitting there, but that command and control center it's imperative and it's essential to be taken out, because that is at the heart of protecting civilians, protecting Libyans from being killed, and protecting gang rape. So it depends how you look at it. I'm not a military expert, but it's not the job of the NATO or the international community to get rid of the Gaddafi regime. It is our job, the Libyan people, and we have been trying and we have been working very hard at it for 4 months now. We lost a lot of blood for that, and we are absolutely determined to carry on and pursue this to the end, and we will succeed very, very soon. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So that should be very clear.
Philip, let's assume a situation that those members of Congress are able to force the president's hand now and make some kind of difference in the U.S. involvement in what's happening in Libya. Tell me how you see that playing out. Would it make a difference to the actions on the ground there? Would it have a difference to the NATO's strategy?
I think it would, from the point of view is that it is essential that as far as the rebels are concerned, that they know that they have U.S. backing. What you don't see in many of the things that are going on at the moment is there is considerable U.S. backing in the surveillance and the ability for building up intelligence on what is happening on the ground. And much of that's done completely out of sight by aircraft which are actually constantly, 24 hours a day, surveying what is going on the ground. And that is essential, and it's essential from the point of view of France and UK and the other allies taking part, but also from the American point of view, because they're the only ones that can actually do that sort of work, and they have the resources to be able to do it. And the issue about munitions, that's something which has come up in the past. Clearly, you know, the UK stockpiles, the French stockpiles are not as considerable as the American ones, and in a way it's inevitable that one has to fall back slightly on American stockpiles to be able to help us through. But to a certain extent, this was foreseeable, and it really should come as no surprise.
But so if that does come to pass, and those facilities that we are now, or NATO is now utilising from the United States, are taken away, what are the options that remain for NATO? Because, you know, we're sitting here talking about how much smoke and mirrors was involved in the original resolution that authorised NATO. We can also begin to speculate now that smoke and mirrors may also be concealing the possibility of boots on the ground, because boots have already been seen on the ground, and we have to entertain the idea that there's plenty more troops ready to go in if and when necessary.
I think from the point of view of certainly the key countries involved, the UK and France, and perhaps other countries as well, there are troops standing by waiting to go if the need be to actually go in. At the moment, they believe a graduated increasing of pressure in support of what the rebels is doing is actually going to do the trick. And I think there's an interesting parallel here which one ought to bear in mind. Is Sarkozy feels that he had a certain amount of success in Côte d'Ivoire using a similar sort of technique, basically using helicopters towards the end, but not actually using his own troops to help the Ivoirians. The same thing is happening here. We basically have the rebels believing they're on the right side of history. They believe that they've got right behind them, they've got United Nations behind them, and at the end of the day, they've got key allies like France, UK, and America in their support. Right. And I think that is an important part of making a success out of this.
Is that the case, Guma? Is it as Philip says? And would you welcome actual ground forces to come in and help you?
No, I don't think we would. There is no need for that. The resolution 1973 stipulates very clearly no invasion or occupation of Libya, and there are no troops on the ground at the moment, despite what some people say. Just because there are few military advisors in Benghazi as part of the missions of various countries, that does not make it an occupation for an army already in Libya. And also, the need might not rise at all, because look, most of Libya is now liberated, the whole of the east, Misrata, most of the western mountain, and we did not need any foreign troops to stabilize those parts or keep security there. Things are reasonably well. We are administering those parts very well. Security has been quite good. We have not, those parts of Libya have not slided into chaos or what some people warn against some sort of a failed state. So I don't think we will need that. I think everybody is now concentrating mind on what will happen in Tripoli the morning after, because that is obviously a very big city. It's the capital with a large population, and I can assure you that the National Transitional Council has already been working on that in great detail. They have concentrated mind. They have come up with a detailed roadmap and a detailed emergency plan of how to stabilize Tripoli immediately the morning after, stabilize it in terms of security, and to prevent any kind of violence or lawlessness or breakdown in security. So I don't think we will need foreign troops. I think we are very much capable of maintaining our own stability and stabilize our country. We are not going to dismiss everybody who has worked in the regime for the last 40 years.
That all remains to be seen, and we'll get to that as and when necessary. Justin, let me come to you and address one of the issues that Philip just brought up, and that is Sarkozy's thinking on this and his motivation on this. From your perspective on that side of the Atlantic, the US in many ways didn't really want to get involved in this in the first place, and much of it was driven by Sarkozy and by David Cameron. What's the thinking where you are as to what was motivating these two to get involved in this adventure?
Well, far be it from me to peer into the recesses of President Sarkozy's mind in thinking about this. Sure, to some extent. I think what's actually more interesting is what made Sarkozy's and Cameron's arguments persuasive to President Obama, because after all, that was the sort of sine qua non that everyone was looking at in the context of this. And President Obama made a number of different arguments, many of which I think were actually flawed, but one of them was that we needed to intervene in this case to send a signal to other dictators that were looking at similar unrest in their countries and the potential of civil war, and that is that the use of violence to tamp down protests would not be permitted. And I think the dilemma there is that you've seen, for example, in Syria that a rather different lesson has been learned. That the lesson is hurry up and kill the people as quickly as you can before the United States can potentially become involved. So that, I think, is evidence that some of the arguments that President Obama became persuaded of may not be working out as he had intended.
Well, that's an interesting line in itself that deserves a lot more attention. But where I really wanted to go with that, Philip, was to come back to the point that you brought up, and that is the NATO, the overall NATO situation. Because what we have here is Sarkozy and Cameron suddenly getting involved in the idea of intervention and regime change, nation building overseas, the use of international organizations in military operation in ways that perhaps surprised a lot of people. And you have to wonder how this plays into the whole argument about NATO and its structure, because, you know, Robert Gates' criticism of Europe not spending enough money in the NATO organization is easily countered by saying, well, Europe's not facing any threats anymore. Why should it be spending that much money? And it's only to back up people like Gates and the American side of things that they would want to do that, isn't it?
Okay, very, very much so. And I think what one must bear in mind is that there actually has been something that's been going on in the past which you should be aware of, and that there was a declaration of cooperation between the UK and France, which actually was signed off on the 2nd of November last year. And it's a very important declaration, in particular between the UK and France, and it envisaged the whole area of possibility of doing things not only within inside Europe, but outside of Europe as well. So since last year, since November of last year, Cameron and Sarkozy have been very much on the same wavelength. And so all of this ties in. And you have to also see from the German point of view, the Germans were kept out of that particular declaration of cooperation. And to a certain extent, you see the result of that now. Germany has not been involved militarily with the operation in Libya.
And Justin, Germany is a very nice case in point of a nation that can actually sit there and say, look, the biggest threat that led to the creation of NATO, i.e. the Soviet Union, is no longer existing. And our economy and our social structure and our position within Europe is doing very nicely, thank you, without ramping up our military spending and wasting our resources on this. That must annoy Washington to a certain extent.
Well, I think it annoys Washington, and it probably annoys London and Paris as well. I think this just reveals that NATO at this point is little more than a sick joke. We had an instance, as Secretary Gates rightly pointed out, where we have NATO, the mightiest military alliance in the world, beating up on really a third-rate military. And we had our European partners running out of precision-guided munitions. This led to a situation where the United States is essentially borrowing money from China to purchase precision-guided munitions to give to the Europeans to drop on Libya. This is a ridiculous situation, and in a certain sense, part of the blame for this situation lies with the United States. As long as the United States is willing to carry a disproportionate share of the burden of NATO, it's entirely reasonable for European countries to allow the United States to pay for those things. The only way to force Europe to do more is to demonstrate clearly that the United States intends to do less. And I think that could include doing things like getting rid of Article 5, which is the centerpiece of the NATO alliance, or even withdrawing from the NATO alliance. There's a great literature in political science about the economic theory of alliances, and it's essentially a collective action problem. When there's one partner that's much wealthier in providing a collective good, all the other partners have every incentive to shirk. Again, if the United States is willing to pay for these sorts of things, it's entirely reasonable for Europe to spend its money elsewhere.
Again, a point for discussion that we could go on with for a long time. Unfortunately, we don't have too much of the time. Guma, let me come to you for the final comments on this, because all of this theoretical discussion obviously doesn't have much bearing on the real immediate problems that Libya has on the ground right now. Now, you spoke with hope about the possibility that it won't be long before your problems will involve not military ones, but how to build a new government and a new country. How do you see that happening in the international context? Do you think that the Transitional Council or whatever body and organisation does take over in Tripoli at some point, will they need international help? Will they need backing from NATO or the United Nations? And to what extent and in what context?
Well, I think one thing we hopefully will not need, and we are determined that we will not need, is for any foreign troops to come in and stabilize our country for us. We want to do that ourselves, and that's why I said immediately post-Gaddafi we are going to be as inclusive as possible and include all those who have worked in the police, in the army, in the security, in the main civil service. We are not going to just decimate a whole state institutions like it has been done in other Arab countries in the past, and we are only going to exclude those few hundreds who have blood on their hands, who have killed people, who have human rights violations, and maybe those who have embezzled public money. That way, hopefully, we will ensure that there is a smoother transition, there is stabilization immediately, and then we can get on with the process of rebuilding Libya politically and so on.
Right, and that element of rebuilding Libya is just as important as any others. I mean, if we rule out the possibility of any kind of military involvement from international forces in Libya, there is still the element of issues like institution building. There's still the element of where Libya's alliances will head towards. And in that region, with that amount of resources at your disposal, a lot of people are going to be wanting to influence the way the new Libyan government thinks. How are you going to deal with those questions?
Well, first of all, we are not going to need any charity. We are an extremely wealthy country. The assets we have frozen outside Libya are worth about $180 billion. Where we're going to need help, probably expertise in institution building, in state building, in capacity building, civil society, in crafting a constitution, in the processes and mechanisms of doing that. And that help we can draw on from wide-ranging countries in the world, from Scandinavia, from some Muslim countries, from key countries like Britain and France and so on. We are going to be open-minded, and we will get advice where we think advice is very useful and helpful to us. But the main thing is we want to be driving that process. We want to take over, take charge of our country immediately and go through, hopefully, as smooth a transition as possible until we get to a legitimate, constitutional, democratic government based on people's elections and people's mandate.
And there we will have to leave it. Thank you very much indeed, Guma el-Gamaty in London, and also to my other guests, Justin Logan in Washington, D.C., Philip Stonor joining us from Paris. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us today. That is it for this edition of Inside Story. Thank you for watching, and we always welcome your comments and suggestions. Our email is insidestory@aljazeera.net. For the moment, it's goodbye.